It's ad break time. I'm pleased to announce that the Beyond Solitaire podcast remains proudly sponsored by Central Michigan University's Center for Learning Through Games and Simulations. And as usual, they are up to amazing things. Their latest game, 500-Year-Old Vampire, just finished a very successful campaign, but if you forgot to back it, you can now pre-order through BackerKit. The link is in the show notes. I also want to plug my own Patreon. Your support means a lot to me, both emotionally and financially. Patreon money is what makes it possible to keep improving my channel by upgrading the equipment, and I'm also hoping to increase the amount of videos I can publish over the course of the next year. If you want to help out, head over to patreon.com/beyondsolitaire. For now, though, let's get on with the show. Hey, gamers, this is Liz Davidson from Beyond Solitaire, and I am here on the podcast today with a special guest. This is Amabel Holland of Holland Spiel, a repeat guest. How you doing, Amabel?
I'm doing all right. How are you?
I'm doing great. I love having you on. We always have a good conversation, so I'm really looking forward to this.
Mm-hmm.
So I've actually brought you on today to talk about your upcoming, I guess, big game of the year. Is that how you would describe it?
Yeah, it's the big end of year game, the one that tries to have a message or tries to have something exploring. Yeah.
And this year you picked a doozy. This one is called Doubt is Our Product. So why don't you tell us what the game's about?
Yeah, it's about the use of disinformation by the tobacco industry in the 20th century to avoid culpability for 100 million deaths. It's important to know that the link between smoking and cancer was first established in the 1920s, and with more definitive proof coming in 1950. And for the 5 decades following, the tobacco industry just kind of pretended that wasn't the case and would argue that it wasn't the case, and they'd hire cranks and hacks to go against the scientific consensus in order to protect their profits. They'd use their deep pockets to avoid meaningful regulation, and to hire lawyers to avoid lawsuits. And this pretty much was the state of things, because I grew up certainly in an environment where smoking was very normalized, where both my parents were heavy smokers. Smoking was in restaurants and doctors' offices and so forth. And in the 80s, secondhand smoke, studies came out to show secondhand smoke existed. And that really provided a way for activists to say, hey, we have a right to breathable air, and to reframe the conversation around that, which led to the banning of smoking in public places. And most of the United States now, you cannot smoke in public in restaurants. So it was very gradual, but it did happen. And it also led to the leaking of a lot of documents from within the tobacco industry, which proved that they knew that they were lying. They knew they were lying about it causing cancer. They were targeting children, and they lied about it. They knew it was addictive, and they, in fact, found ways to make it more addictive, and they lied about it. And that led to a series of lawsuits culminating in a 46-state class action lawsuit that tried to get reimbursement for the medical costs for end-of-life care and other medical care paid by the states. Unfortunately, a settlement was reached, which gave the tobacco industry immunity from prosecution for this. In exchange, they would pay $200 billion over the course of about 20 years. In context, they make about $900 billion a year. So that's what this game is about.
This math ain't mathin'. I'm just gonna...
Yeah, no, it's a slap on the wrist. I mean, we live in a world where less people, at least in America, are smoking. Certainly there are rising rates of smoking, especially underage smokers overseas, where they have much less regulation and they can market kind of in an unrestricted way. But we live in a world where I don't need to worry about going to a restaurant and the whole thing smelling like smoke, where most people are aware that it causes cancer and will not argue with that too severely. But we also live in a world where they got away with it. And that's where this game comes from. This is what the game is trying to represent.
Interesting. Yeah, it's really funny having this conversation makes me have my own childhood memories of like back when restaurants had smoking sections and
Hmm.
that
You
was
know,
gross times actually. Now that I think about it.
and I was even like, by the time I was born, like there were no longer smoking advertisements on television. But I was talking to Mary, and like who's the owner of Holland, and when she was a kid, she remembers there being ads for cigarettes on TV.
I remember Joe Camel. I remember knowing who
Hmm.
that was. I don't remember how I knew, but I knew who he was
Hmm.
and could still pick him out in a picture.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
and he was specifically made to target children. In the game itself, I provided some of the documents that have been released from within the tobacco industry, and one of them is a memo about how do we get children to start smoking. I mean, not openly because it was behind closed doors, but I mean, they're not hiding what they're doing. They're like, yeah, we can't sell them cigarettes legally, and we don't think that's fair, and because this is where we need those new consumers to come from. How do we get them to start smoking? Because smoking actually is really irritating to the pre-smoker and the new smoker. So how do we find ways to create an environment where there is a pressure to smoke, where it's such a normalized thing, showing independence and whatnot, they will get them to smoke. So these children will start smoking and then become lifelong smokers.
Holy shit.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay, so how do you make this into a game though? Like, what are we doing in this game and who's
Yeah.
doing it?
Okay. So there are two players. Like a lot of my angry political games, there are two directly opposed players. One represents the industry. It's called the company, and that player is, well. Here's the thing. So there's that player, and then there's the other player called the movement, which represents kind of a disparate group of grassroots activists, scientists, public servants, legislators, and whatnot that are broadly working against tobacco interests and for the addressing of this humongous public health crisis. And each player is playing a different game. Like there is a different set of components, different rules, different flow of play for each player. The rule book is actually now, I sounded real smart on social media when I used the French word for it. Now I can't remember the word. So it's a book where there is no back. There are two fronts, and they're reversed from each other. So you have
Mhm.
one set of rules reading one way, the other set reading the other way. And so the company player is playing a deck building game. You're doing an economic engine building thing. You're adding to your deck. You're trying to market to your customers, and you're trying to protect your customer base from being convinced not to smoke by creating doubt. And this is where the title comes from, is a very famous memo where they said that doubt is our product. It's how we create opposition to the body of fact that smoking causes cancer. We can't say that smoking is healthy, but we can say that we're not sure and we need more research and there's a debate and etc. So you are creating doubt, you're creating disinformation in order to protect that while pursuing your financial goals. So this is a deck building game. You are for that player, you are playing cards and buying cards and adding to your deck and taking stuff out of your deck. Everyone basically knows how a deck building game works these days, at least within the hobby space.
Yeah.
The other player is playing like a political tableau builder, where you are buying cards from a market and adding them to your tableau. These cards have action icons that revolve around researching, getting messaging out, and agitating for legislative change. And when you buy a card from the market, the space you buy it from has an action associated with it, much like in my game Nicaea. So you are buying a card from the market to do an action using what's in your tableau to perform that action, and then adding stuff to your tableau. And so the turn structure is very, you either buy a card or you play a card. You have like one thing you're doing. So we have the tobacco company player who is getting this hand of cards, and you're playing some cards and buying a card. You're going for big turns. The turns for the other player are much shorter and smaller, but you are gradually over time building political influence across these disparate people in order to achieve your goals. And so it's also in some ways a sort of racing game in that the company player, the shorter the game is, the more likely they are to win because they start off pretty strong and they get stronger. But over time, the other player gets stronger and is able to shift the conversation into their favor. At the center of this, though, is the game's model of disinformation, because it is much easier to put disinformation out there than it is to remove it. It takes much more effort to remove and debunk bad information than it is just to put it out there. And this also is influenced by where the disinformation is being presented. So I have it in four for groups that are by age. So the older the people being targeted with the disinformation are, the harder it is to debunk it.
This sounds
Um,
eerily familiar.
yeah, here's the thing. I mean, I a huge impetus for this game. There are a few different, but one of them is my interest in fears and apprehensions about disinformation, especially in an age where that disinformation is used either for dangerous, violent political gain or for demonizing marginalized populations. I'm certainly very familiar with disinformation about queer and trans people, um, or the way that corporations deliberately use disinformation, basically following the tobacco company's playbook to avoid change or culpability surrounding issues like global warming or asbestos, for that matter. The asbestos industry did the same thing.
Oh, that's interesting. So, I mean, you and I both have memories of kind of the world before smoking in public places wasn't a thing.
Mhm.
But what inspired you to make this particular game? Is it something you've been thinking about for a while? Or is it something that, you came across information and it sparked an interest? What was the inspiration process here?
Well, is something I've been thinking about for a while since really since around the time I did this Guilty Land. But I mean, its roots are certainly earlier. Like I said, both my parents were very heavy smokers, and my father died of lung cancer when he was 38. I was still
Cool.
in high school, and my mother at the time would say that the smoking hadn't caused the cancer while continuing to smoke herself. That the doctors put it in there, and this is because she grew up in a time when there was that debate, and yet I address this somewhat in a kind of personal introduction that's in one of the booklets in the game. Um, she also knew that smoking caused cancer, right? It was a convenient lie for her to hold on to when she wanted to, so that she could justify continuing to do so. And yeah, so that I mean that's where it came from, and and the tobacco industry actually, was almost regulated by the FDA. There were certainly several attempts to do that, and the Supreme Court said, "No, we're not doing this." Just a few weeks after my father died, to put it in. So it's like it's very recent history, you know.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, yeah, it was over 20 years ago, but this is weird because most of the stuff I'm covering in the game happened in my lifetime, and that's not usually what I do. But yeah, that's a lot of that came from there. A lot of my anger around just the moral outrage around the fact that this industry only really existed to cause harm. Like there's no benefit for smoking, and it's and they knowingly lied, you know. And it's
Yeah.
been depressing. Like usually when I do these big end of year games, it's depressing because I'm digging into a lot of primary materials, and there are literally millions of pages of tobacco industry documents to dig into. And like I said, I included three of them in the game itself, that I thought were particularly striking and egregious.
So, just out of curiosity, like, how do you access the documents? Is this like a public library thing? Are they online? I actually
No,
wouldn't even know where to start.
they are online. I forget the exact name of the archive, but like is hosted online. Part of the tobacco master settlement agreement, which gave them immunity to prosecution, also mandated the release of these documents and their maintenance in a publicly accessible way online. That money they spent they paid also went towards the Truth Initiative. So those truth.com commercials,
Yeah,
PSAs come from there as well.
interesting. So, as you test your game, do you prefer to play one side over the other, or were you committed to making both sides entertaining to play, even though you obviously
Ye-
hate one for good reason?
Yeah. So I prefer playing the movement side. Um, my brain is better suited towards playing deck builder, so it's more challenging for me to play a tableau builder. There's a lot of tricky timing things and whatnot, and you're kind of the underdog. So that's a fun time. I mean, yeah, I did try to make sure that ludically that both sides would be satisfying to play while, hopefully causing some discomfort or disquiet when playing the company side. So I gave them the very because a lot of people like deck building games, right? It's really pleasurable to build this thing over time and see it evolve and whatnot. And so that's and it's easy to see how to plan for a big turn and whatnot. So I wanted to make sure that that was the case because one criticism that I received from some of my other like angry political games is that they found the bad guy side to be less interesting to play. So I wanted to make sure that was quite a bit of interest within that um, that player role. Um, yeah, so that's my answer to that question.
Yeah. So, like, what ways did you choose to insert kind of discomforting things into the deck building side of the game?
Well,
How? I mean, is it overt? Is it, are there like just little subtle things where it's like, oh, are we the baddies? Yeah. How do we get there?
so I very specifically wanted to avoid anything because there's a way you could do a game like this where because the tobacco industry used quite slick advertising campaigns and methods where you could lean into that and have a very slick presentation like a retro 50s kind of feel, and I studiously avoided that. I really drained it all of any kind of you know thematic glamour to hang on to. It's a very dry presentation for that side, and I kind of stripped it of euphemism. You know the word. You know the word I'm thinking of.
Euphemism.
Yeah. Um, where, for example, the customers are not referred to as customers; they're referred to as victims. I am always trying to center what is actually going on here, rather than the pretty lie. Um, because I feel like that's how you cause some disquiet. Whereas on the other side, I try to make it much more human. I try to emphasize kind of the grassroots nature of it with artwork that's a bit more expressive in some ways, that feels more handmade. And I have a lot of flavor text, a lot of explanation. There's not a lot of explanation for the tobacco side by choice. So you have just none of the kind of color or flavor that brings you in. I want to keep you kind of distant from it. And also, every time you go through your deck is when you do a scoring round, and the scoring round goes through these different demographics. And first, um, people die, and then you score the remainder. And the older they get, the more of them die. And so it's like I don't feel like there's any distance between you and what you're doing as far as like being able to deny it or gloss over it. The way in some games, for example, you might gloss over that what you're representing is slavery,
Yeah.
famously in some Euro games. So I wanted to really just emphasize the horror of what the industry is doing and the kind of inhumanity of it, while recognize that these are human actors doing it, but they're also doing it. I mean, really, the villain here, as much as it is like bad actors and whatnot, is capitalism. Because it's the striving for profits over human lives. You know,
Yeah. Yeah, makes sense. So I noticed earlier you said that you incorporated some feedback from previous games into your development of the bad guy side of this particular game. I actually wanted to ask a question about that, which is how do you decide when you make political games, angry political games that people are gonna have feelings about? How do you determine what feedback is actually useful? And then how do you determine that feedback should just be tossed because the person's clearly just mad about your game?
I mean, I can kind of tell when someone's just mad about a thing and when someone is like seeing what I'm going for, but maybe feels like something is come up a little short, you know. But it's always a process of grappling and wondering and doubting and going back and forth on it. There's never a clean, easy way to do it. That's just part of the process, I guess, is just trying to sit with it and figure it out. It's like, well, are they right? No, they're not. Well, maybe they are. And the thing too is that those angry political games were all made. It feels like they're made by a different person.
Mm.
There's a different name on the box, famously, but also it's like my brain works differently now that I have the correct hormonal balance, and so I see things with a bit more clarity, and I approach things a bit differently. If I was to do those angry political games again today, if I was today as me going to do a game like this Guilty Land or The Vote, I probably would approach some things quite differently. It certainly would be a bit cleaner and less complicated. Which is something I'm striving for here. It's really interesting. I can't get into too many details just yet, but earlier this year, there was a journalist who came and hung out and followed me around for a couple days to do a profile on me, which might see publication sometime. Um, and he played this Guilty Land, and trying to teach the game, I just realized how many little exceptions there are to
Mhm.
everything and how complicated it is. And that's complicated by the standards of like a hobby game. And this is someone who didn't really know hobby games all that well. So for him, it was especially obtuse. And I feel like, especially with these angry political games, when trying to get some kind of message out or express something or explore something, while I'm using very much the language of hobby games, I you can't make you can't reach a broad audience by making it obtuse. You
Right.
know, you and a lot of ways it feels like I'm preaching to the converted. Like it feels like a lot of people who would pick up this Guilty Land would to be as conversant in board games and have an interest in that game. Probably are the kind of people where they don't really need to hear the message as much.
Mm.
You know, um, Whereas like normal people normal people who might benefit from it more. Um, they're less likely to seek out a $55, $60 board game with these complicated mechanics and complicated rule book and rule 4.3.2a and all that. So I tried very much to avoid that and make it much more like a Euro game, which is still like hobby market, right? But um is a different kind of hobby market than like war games.
Right. Right. So, kind of down that vein, this is interesting. So do you think that any other aspects of your design priorities or topic choices or any of that have changed as a result of your transition?
Uh, Probably. Like, I'm doing a lot less hex and counter games. I'm a lot less interested in like the battle of whatever than I used to be. Still like some operational stuff, but I'm much more attracted to political conflict, to these sort of message games, and then also like to like science fiction, fantasy, and horror, which weren't really avenues I explored very much previously. Like I had a science fiction and a fantasy game, and they both flopped tremendously. This was back in my freelance days. And I just had a science fiction game come out a month or two ago, which was Kaiju Table Battles, and it's done fairly well. And I use it to express things that were important to me about queerness and about transition. And that way it was much more personal and there's much more me in the games now. So I think that's definitely something that um, is evident to me in how I approach the games and topics and whatnot.
Yeah, kind of in that vein. So, among your like big message games that have come out last few years, we have things like The Vote and This Guilty Land.
Mhm.
And then I remember right when you were first out in public as Amabel, we did Nicaea. And
Mhm.
since then we've done Endurance, and now here we're doing Doubt as our product. Do you think that there's more and more of you in your games as we go by? Like, you can talk about issues, but
Mhm.
there's issues that are like your soul's in it, and there's issues that are interesting issues.
Yeah, I mean, those other games, like Disc Guilty Land and The Vote, were things I was tremendously invested in at the time, and I felt very strongly about. But um, certainly, I feel like the later work has gotten more personal. I tend to joke that Nicaea was me processing my religious trauma, and people gave me $50 a pop for it. And Endurance certainly is not a game I could have made before transition. I tried, and I couldn't do it. And um, my own transition gave me a lot of insights and appreciation for surviving and the way and suffering and the way that sometimes the odds are very much against something, but it happens, and isn't that wonderful? um
Yes.
and then of course this and this is I mean this is something that has it's some personal business for sure, you know um with my family history, and also just having grown up in that world, because I couldn't breathe. I had terrible respiratory problems as a child. I could barely taste anything. It wasn't until I was out of my parents' house, out of a smoking environment, that I actually realized, oh, this is what air smells like. This is what food's supposed to taste like. Everything was so muted and ugly on the tongue, and it was such a huge change for me. And yeah, so I have a lot of anger. I have a lot of anger about capitalism in general and corporations getting away with shit and continuing to, because that's the story. Like, maybe we can do something about global warming, but you know what? The people who caused it, they're not going to suffer a lick for it.
No, everybody else will, but not them. They'll be fine. So the other thing I want to touch on that we've talked about is you mentioned kind of an interest in creating games that are more accessible and that maybe somebody who needs to hear your message but isn't necessarily primed to could hear it. How does that change an attitude square with the fact that Holland is like a proudly quirky, proudly small, proudly niche publisher? And is that something that you want to change, or are you just trying to reach more people from within your preferred like market share?
I'm trying to reach more. It's a difficult thing that I still grapple with quite a bit. Like I grapple with the idea even of making physical games in a world where physical resources are scarce, and I grapple with this question of reaching a broader audience. Because there are ways in which games are in and of themselves an inaccessible form. If you look at like video games have a much broader reach because they teach you the game as you're playing it.
Mm.
You don't need to learn the systems of a game before you start playing it. With a board game, you kind of do. And in fact, in games where it's trying to center observation of a model, which is my whole deal, you need to be able to comprehend that model in order to even begin to engage with it. And so there's ways in which it is just an intractable problem that can't be solved. And I'm just taking little half steps towards trying to solve something I'm very dissatisfied about with the forum and with my work. And I don't know if I'm ever going to get there. I feel like probably the best bet is I do something that from within my niche that inspires someone who's more talented than I am to do something that will actually hit and resonate with people.
So you want to be John the Baptist to somebody else's Jesus? No, I'm messing with you.
No,
I'm teasing. I'm teasing. I'm
oh
teasing.
god, no. But like there's such a thing as like a comedian's comedian or an artist's artist. Writer's writer, that sort of thing. That's probably my niche. I'm not terribly happy with that. I do want to have a broader reach for things. Particularly, I want to make games uh, that will help people see aspects of themselves. Because a big part of how I figured out myself was seeing my experiences reflected in those of others. And I want to use games to do that. But how do I do that from a print on demand niche with weird games? Like I don't have the ability to make a normal game. Even my games that are arguably normal, like the train games that got broader release, they're still kind of weird. You know.
I would argue that that is part of their charm, but yes.
I mean, I agree, but also it prevents that kind of mass media appeal.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean that's something I think about as somebody who makes YouTube videos all the time too. Like there are things that I just refuse to do because I just won't do it because I don't like it. That would
Mhm,
make my channel I think do better, but I won't because I want to do
mhm.
what I want to do. There's always like that kind of tension I think between doing what you want and then attempting to get other people to engage with what you wanted to make.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure, and I'm familiar with that in a YouTube way as well. Oh, oh, dear.
But because you can never just do things the normal way, which is one of my favorite things about you as a person and as a designer. You've also been very much on I think, the vanguard of people who are interested in releasing games that don't have win conditions. So Endurance was one such game.
Mhm.
But there's another that has come out from Holland that's generated some buzz recently. Would you like to talk about that one?
Are we talking about Veloca Rapture from Zoe Alred? No?
No, but I do want to talk about that too. No, the POW one.
Oh, that others may live. Yes.
Yes.
We release a lot of games.
It's good.
You know,
There's
like
more that don't have victory conditions. That's the question. That's fascinating. Okay, yes.
that others may live does have a victory condition, but was so let me I'll give the short version for people who obviously might not be familiar. So it's a game about combat search and rescue missions in Vietnam, and you are trying to rescue people who are shot down before the enemy finds and captures them. And if the enemy captures even just one person that's shot down, then you've lost the game, but you keep playing the game because there are still people out there to rescue. And the rules that Brad Smith, the designer, wrote state, continue to play the game, attempting to learn from your failures. And because I really like the way that emphasizes the kind of human element of it, because yeah, if you are conducting a combat search and rescue mission and one of the people you're trying to rescue can't be rescued, you're not gonna say, well, we can't win. We're 2 points short. We're gonna leave everyone else behind. No, you're gonna go try to find them because these are human beings that you're trying to save. And so I was really impressed by that design decision on Brad's part. Um, and it certainly got me thinking about victory conditions and ways in which games don't necessarily need to have the victory condition be the source of meaning. Source of meaning could be in conflict with the victory condition itself, or it could have no victory conditions, which I know I have had a couple games without victory conditions myself, and that's what got me thinking about it. Where recently I did a little thing about that got some attention, some positive, some less so. You know,
So what do you think that playing around with the idea of victory and winning can do, as somebody who wants games to say something and to communicate an experience as opposed to just a competition?
well, I think that there are ways in which, because victory conditions frame the incentives and frame our understanding of a game, there are ways in which they sometimes can get in the way of uh, expressing things that are more human and less quantifiable. So I think it's useful to think about, because like most of the time you do need to have a victory condition in a game, right? But not not always. And sometimes it's useful to think like, what do we gain by not doing that, by setting that aside, or by having a game that doesn't have a victory condition at all, like endurance, where you have a goal, which is to get to the end of this thing with as many people intact as possible. Well, I'm not going to tell you that you won or you lost, or that because you saved 25 people instead of 24, that you won, because there are still people who are gone and people who survived, and you just have to decide how you feel about that, and creating a space in which players can kind of uncomfortably sit with their decisions, with the regrets that can come with that.
Yeah.
I think is useful. I think most artwork, most forms of art have examples where you can't resolve the thing neatly,
Right.
where you have to kind of sit with it and figure out what it feels like without maybe you never finding an answer, and just grappling with it. It's a very human thing, and it's something that is often lacking in board games, despite board games being one of the oldest art forms that we have.
That is an interesting put. That's an interesting way to put that. So I don't know anything about Veloca Rapture, but I think that we need to bring that into the conversation now. I kind of
Okay.
put a pin in that mentally.
Okay. Veloca Rapture is a game by Zoe Allred, which does not have a victory condition. You are dinosaurs, and the world is going to end when a meteor hits the Earth, and you are having a game night, playing a series of board and card games, waiting for a timer to go out. When the timer goes out, the meteor hits Earth, and you and all your friends are dead. And so while you're playing this series of 36, often quite experimental or silly, sometimes even deliberately broken games, each dinosaur has a coping mechanism, a way in which they are playing the games in order to avoid thinking about their mortality. Like, this one's going to be a rules lawyer. This one's going to try to house rule things. This one wants to keep things moving at a good pace and not let things get slowed down, so everyone's having a good time. And you're using this kind of little personality quirk to guide your play. But then at the end, the meteor's going to hit the Earth, and you're all going to die. So it doesn't matter like who coped the hardest, who did it the best, because you're all dead. Doesn't matter who won the most games because you're all dead. It's the experience itself in the moment that that matters. And I think that's a wonderful choice on Zoe's part.
So I feel like there's a mixture between a board game and an RPG, really. Because being in the character of the dinosaur with the personality quirk that you get seems like an essential part of the experience of playing.
Yeah, and I would say, RPGs are a type of game where there usually aren't victory conditions and where it's very normalized in that space. And there's not the same hostility towards that there is with board games. Like, I have some people be very hostile to me saying board games don't need victory conditions. And they'll be like, well, actually, RPGs aren't actually games. I'm like, I don't know. They're activities. Like, I don't.
I find this such an. I love talking about what is a game. Like, what is a war game has, of course, been a live conversation of my here, as I'm sure you're aware.
Yeah.
It's an adventure every time. But
Yeah.
But I think that what is a game is an equally fraught question. I mean, it seems easy to be like, oh, a game has rules and a win condition. But I
Mhm.
also don't necessarily think that's true because I think that flirting is a game.
Yeah.
And I
And I'm
think
winning. I win at that a lot. I'm world champion.
but also there's not necessarily a win condition for it, right? Like you can just be charmed by somebody else's banter and have a nice moment and you still played and you still won. You know? Or I don't know, like I look at my students play games all the time and everybody's got a different way of playing Uno. Everybody has a different Uno condition, but like
Mhm.
is there really, you know what I mean? At what point is Uno no longer Uno? Is it still a game? Is it still this? It's still that? Like I don't know. I can't help but feel that games are more about the feeling that you have when you play them than they are
Mhm.
like of entering a slightly out of this world place and
Yeah.
engaging in like a communal fantasy moment, even if it's just a very puzzly dry game, right? Like if you're all engaged in that and that is your world for the moment, then you've played. I don't know. I think it's hard to
Yeah.
define. But do you ever I mean, do you also make games though that are so serious? But they're still games, wouldn't you say? It's still play.
Yeah.
So, just kind of in that vein, what have you been playing right now that makes you happy?
So I've been playing a lot of games with my partner Samhain, who is so a little bit of a story. So when I got into the hobby, I thought I was gonna do like Euro games. I played a lot of like mid to heavyweight Euro games, and I designed games of those sort, and they didn't sell. And I ended up as a fluke, as like a lark, designing a war game and a train game, and those things sold and led me to do more of those games. And I got away from playing the Euro games because they're really quite different than the things I tend to do. I'm not really engaged with the mainstream of the hobby. But then last year, I started dating someone who is very into, oh, this game has all these bits and there are 6 different ways to score points, and um it's gotten me to enjoy those kind of games again. So like last night we played Great Western Trail New Zealand. That was a lot of fun. Like I'm enjoying playing those games mostly because of her enjoyment and how much it just like sets her brain on fire to be playing these games with all these interlocking parts. And that's where I get a lot of joy in playing games. I haven't really had that in a while because my interest in games have largely been vocational. And at a certain point, like I still was playing games and I still was enjoying them in the moment, but it wasn't done for the joy of it. It was done
Mhm.
for the work of it. And now I'm able to play these kind of heavy to medium to heavy Euros with her. We played On Mars, the Lacerda game. We played, lots of different little things, some older, some newer, and usually with like an hour and a half teach that starts my brain melting because I don't do good with teaches. actually. Like I really struggle with a teach, and then once I start playing, I try to pick it up a bit. So those are things I've been enjoying, and a lot of that is her. A lot of that is her company and her enthusiasm for the thing and her insights into games. Because she's someone I talk with games a lot about her in a way I haven't with anyone else. There's no one else really I've ever had in my life who understands games and takes them seriously the way she does, and um, it's been a real delight. It's been a real treat. So I think that's where a lot of my gaming enjoyment comes from.
What do you think is the relationship between joy that you feel in gaming and the games that you are doing for work? Do you take joy in it, or is it only satisfaction?
I take joy in it more now than I used to. Um, I think just because I'm more impressed with myself than I used to be. Because the thing, because before, like I always was kind of reaching and groping for a thing without quite always getting there, and now I feel like, oh yeah, I know what I'm doing. I got this, and oh, this was actually really interesting. This thing, just I'm actually good at my job. I will say that out loud sometimes. Like I'm actually pretty good at this, which is not something I was saying before, despite having designed like 70 board games. So, um, and so I do get some joy from it, but it is a work. It is something that I do for work, and I feel like I was on a podcast once. This is years ago, like in the before times, where someone asked me, what games would you be designing if it wasn't for money? And if like it was the show that has like the zombie apocalypse. Like you need 5 games to play in the zombie
Oh, 5 games
apocalypse.
for Doomsday with
Yeah,
Ben.
yeah.
Yeah.
And he asked me, if we're in this post-apocalyptic world and there's no market for games, what games are you designing? And I'm like, none, zero. Like I am doing this for a living, for money, and also like for an audience. If I don't have those things, I wouldn't just do them. I would do other things with my time. I think at the time I said I would like read books or write. That was the before times. Now there are other things that I do with my time that I'm doing with my time currently. Like generally where my free time goes. So um, these orgies aren't going to host themselves.
But yeah, I do think that thinking about, gaming and joy. I feel like when you work in serious games, I mean, where the topics are, I mean, I feel like all games can be quite serious business depending on the attitude that you approach them with, right? But when you're working on topics that are as probably emotionally draining as something like the tobacco industry, um, why do you do it if it doesn't bring you joy? Or does it? It's just sort of like a perverse joy.
I mean, any kind of creative work expression is about communication, right? It's about communicating something to someone else and hopefully having that be seen and received and understood. And I think there's a very human desire to communicate. And so like there's things I want to communicate about. First of all, the history about the tobacco industry, about the things that they did and got away with, but also the ways in which, yeah, it does very much apply. There are things to take from it that are important for the current day and the things that I'm afraid of. So I'm expressing my anger, I'm expressing my fears. Like all that needs to go somewhere. And as someone who's a creative person, who's trying to make a living as a creative person, I'm going to channel it into a creative work. So I think that's largely where it comes from. So there's some satisfaction there. There is some catharsis for sure. Like
Mhm.
I have a lot. Like when I started seeing my current therapist, I did not really talk about religious trauma very much because I kind of got that out of the way doing Nicaea. There's still bits of it that linger. Don't get me wrong, but that really helped me
Mhm.
Doing endurance in a way really helped me with the kind of perverse survivor's guilt that comes with being a trans woman who lived long enough to figure it out. Because there are plenty of us who didn't, and I certainly came close to not. Um, so I mean, in some ways, it's kind of a weird, expensive form of therapy, but also it's just why anyone writes a book, why anyone does any of it. It comes from a human place where you want to be seen and you want others to be able to see themselves and you want to be heard and to express things.
I really like the way you're putting that. I feel like a lot of I think that's one of the reasons I read as much as I do too. Like it gives me that feeling that I've stepped into somebody else's mind and like seen a different world. So
Mhm.
when it comes to games, I feel like we don't often talk about games that way, but I do
I
want
would
to.
like to. I
I
would like
want
to.
to.
Yeah, I want more of that.
So just kind of as like a final question, and this might be kind of a tough one actually, because I'm thinking myself, like I feel like I play your games and I know you better. What is a game that you've played by somebody else that felt like you got to know them or understood a piece of them from playing their work?
Um, you get it more with the RPGs and the board games these days. Um, Certainly, some of Travis Hill's RPGs, for example, I think have a very strong insight into the kind of person he is and gave me a better understanding of him. A lot of people try not to foreground it as much.
Mhm.
I think, unfortunately, I think more personality in games is important. Though I think I learned something about Erin Escobedo playing Meltwater. I think that's where it started because she's a dear friend of mine. She is largely responsible for me figuring my shit out. Um, and that friendship progressed in stages, but there was something in Meltwater in its anger, in its black comedy, in the ways in which it's a system that gets smaller and harsher that told me things about her that made her someone that I could talk to. So I think there's a bit of that. And certainly I try to do that in my games. I try like uh, uh Kaiju Table Battles and then the Stowser product both have like extremely personal essays in the front matter of it. Just not only to frame the work, but to present more of me in a way that is probably a bit more vulnerable than a lot of people do with games. There's a real desire with games, I think, to put distance between, to ignore the author, to put distance between the author and the thing where you may not even know who designed the game. There are very few designers, I think, who go out of the way to center their authorial voice. Freedom and Freesh, maybe.
Mm.
You know, I certainly know when something's a Freedom and Freesh game. you know, I'm not sure if
Yeah.
I get a lot of insights about Freedom and Freesh's personality, but I certainly like
Yeah.
know. You know,
You at least get a sense of his taste and of
hmm
his preoccupations, which I think is also an insight, I suppose. But yeah, I mean, I think about this especially as I'm starting to dip my own little toes in the world of game design. It's like, how will I be read and how do I communicate better? Because games are communication. They're an experience, and they're a different kind of communication than a book, right? Because it's not you can't read through a game from beginning to end, or else then that really would not be a game.
yeah,
The thing that makes a game is participation. So yeah, I kind of hope we have more conversations like that in the future. Maybe next year when you've got your next flagship game coming out.
yeah. I don't know what I'm doing next year yet. I mean, I have some games coming out next year, obviously, but I don't know what the big end of year thing is yet. Thing I'm working on right now. I'm working on a solitaire horror game without a victory condition.
Victory-less games.
Yeah.
I like it. I like it. I'm looking forward to the horror one too. First of all, I just want to always thank you for your time. I love having conversations with you because I always learn something from them and always have a good time. So I really appreciate that you are continually willing to come on the show and talk to me.
Well, I likewise enjoy conversing with you as well. It's always educational and always entertaining. It has a nice, like the first time I did an interview as Amabel, that was with you. Actually, like there was a reason for that.
I appreciate it because I feel like our friendship has spanned names, years. May it continue for a long time. But until the next time we talk publicly on the podcast, where can people find you and your work? Because I think that they should be engaging with it.
Well, the website is hollandspiel.com. I am still at the moment on the Twitter. I'm not super happy about being on the Twitter, but
yeah.
But you know, it still remains like the best trans femme dating app. So like I kind of don't have a choice there, really. I'm also on the Blue Sky. I'm just amabel.beatsky.social. Just search for Amabel. Like I guess have just my first name. That's great. I picked the first name that no one else had, and there were a bunch of Twitter users with it. It was awful. But this, you know, I got in early. So
I dig it. I dig it. I, of course, can be found anywhere as Beyond Solitaire, and I'm terminally online and therefore very easy to get in touch with. But again, Amabel, thanks for coming on. And those of you who are out there, please like, subscribe, comment, ask questions, and most of all, happy gaming.